I am trying to encourage students to look for graduate education in fine art. And how better than to show them that this is a path that is sustainable, or that artists can keep working after they leave school.
Welcome to Artists in Offices, a podcast that explores, through interviews with working artists, the idea that the work you do for pay supports the work you do for love. Or does it? I'm your host, Rebecca Bird Grigsby, visual artist, crafty generalist, and dance enthusiast. Though I now have a part-time day job, in 2017, I quit my previous full-time gig and spent the next 2 years rebooting my studio practice while trying to figure out my next career move. Each episode of this podcast explores the perspective of an individual artist juggling their creative practice with their day job. In this bonus episode between seasons, I talked to Lennon Michelle Wolcott Hernandez, a Boston-based interdisciplinary artist who works in graduate admissions. In All Work and No Play, a solo exhibition at 263 Gallery in Cambridge, Lennon explores how having a full-time job impacts artists' time for creativity and practice.
My name is Lennon Michelle Wolcott Hernandez. I am 34 years old and I live in Boston.
So you currently work in graduate admissions at SMFA at Tufts University, where I know you also went to grad school. How do you describe yourself when people ask, what do you do?
That's a great question. It comes up in both the artist and working sphere. And so now I just say that I'm an artist who on the weekend likes to admit students to grad programs for fun.
Great. So, and you said on the weekends, is that when most of your work takes place?
No, I work during the week, but I think that a lot of admissions work actually works during the weekend, as well as just flipping the script that one is the job and the other is not.
Right. Totally. I love that. So you're prioritizing in a way, kind of the traditional work week for your identity as an artist.
Correct.
So let's talk a little bit about your formal training. When did you decide that being an artist was something you wanted to pursue, and, where did you go from there?
I've been drawing as long as I can remember, probably since 5, just kept going with that. And then when I had the great chance, my mom is a faculty member at a community college. So I started taking classes when I was about 17 at a community college in drawing and printmaking, continuing on that for a couple of years, taking as many classes as I could before deciding to full-time go for that at Michigan State University with a BFA in studio art. Followed by a post-bac certificate at the School Museum of Fine Arts, and then finally my master's at SMFA at Tufts.
Cool. So did you go straight through from the post-bac to the MFA program?
From the post-bac to MFA, yes.
Mm-hmm. And so it sounds like you had the support of your family in pursuing this.
Yes,
my career.
My mom was, she's an educator, and I think that she understood the value of that education. And she was a little concerned about being an artist itself, but felt that if I had the support of understanding what it looks like in the real world, that it was a good idea.
So for those not familiar with your work, describe your creative practice and, kind of what your work looks like.
So I talk about decolonization and kind of a loss of culture through rebuilding of community. In the last couple of years, that's taken the practice of looking at traditional craft work. My basis is in printmaking and sculpture, and so I started thinking about how traditions started. So I work with Papel Picado's creations of sculptures that range similar things to like piñatas and kind of semi-hybrid sculptures.
I'm curious how grad school affected your creative practice. Like, is this work you've been doing kind of like a body of work that you've been doing for a while, or did this come from your time at museum school?
Before the museum school, I was kind of more all over the place wherever my head would take me. A lot of times I dealt with nature, specifically flowers and kind of natural forms. And so when I came to both the post-bac and grad, I started looking at research. And through discussions with faculty and a really supportive mentorship, I realized that these flowers were really thinking about loss. And that took me to shrines and community and loss of culture. And that led me to colonization and then decolonization. So a lot of this came through what I naturally was interested in and then pushed through research.
Well, that sounds great. So you kind of got that like critical thinking kind of backbone to the work through your experience in grad school?
Definitely that. And then my mom has a philosophy background. So I think that through conversations at school and home and the ideas of community, it started to kind of build up that this just made sense for who I was.
So before we talk a little bit more about your current day job, describe, if you want, some of your past day jobs and if any were sort of more or less conducive to maintaining your creative practice alongside that.
Before undergrad, I had things like a balloon shop and horse riding training. After undergrad, I worked at a framing shop and the director of the art room at the Boys and Girls Club. And then really staying within art and education, I worked as a resident director for the dorms when I was in grad school with SMFA at Tufts, and then as a residential coordinator for the summer programs at SMFA, Emerson, and Mass Art.
So did that work kind of naturally evolve into like giving you the experience you needed for your current day job?
I think so. I think slowly since I was about 16, I've worked in the areas surrounding teaching or working with students and working through skills that I had to share those. And I think that those kind of like helping people figure out what they're thinking about led me to both continue working in art and in admissions.
One thing that you wrote in your response to the survey that I've connected to the podcast is a very interesting, I think, kind of unique arrangement that you have in terms of how you split up your studio space. So it sounds like your current kind of studio setup is sort of split between your apartment, your home, and your office. So I'm curious if you could talk a little bit about that arrangement and elaborate on how you negotiate that space use. It sounds like you're using your office space outside of work time, but I'm still curious how if you could kind of get into the details on how you've come to that, and then how you kind of negotiate that with your paid work.
So one great thing about working at an art school is that when I have to bring students back to view my office and sit and talk, they are not upset to see work in progress or current work and seeing that I am still a practicing artist when I'm talking about school. And so I do smaller pieces, paintings, drawings in my apartment at my house, little projects. But as I want to build things up, thinking towards finalized pieces like the show I was getting ready for now, bring them together to kind of build pieces and put them up on the walls, kind of see how they work. And so I've been able to utilize it for like bigger projects where it might be a little bit more sculptural. I have a little bit of space in my office that I have tables and walls I can set things out on and just kind of use those, after work at 4:30, 5 o'clock, sit here and work versus taking things at home where it's more relaxed and it's like painting, drawing smaller projects.
So, but you feel like you're supported in your kind of work environment to do that. Like I said, even though it sounds like you're doing it outside of work time, I can imagine this might sound like unfamiliar to a lot of people listening. Yeah. So do you feel like that, like your kind of like, kind of split identity between being an artist and an administrator is maybe more supported because you're working at an art school?
Oh, definitely. And one of the things that I share with my boss and we both agree with is that I am trying to encourage students to look for graduate education in fine art. And how better than to show them that this is a path that is sustainable or that artists can keep working after they leave school. And I think that my boss has been really very thoughtful about letting me blur those lines as long as I'm getting my work done. And using this space, and I will say that my office is actually located in the graduate studios of SMFA. So I'm constantly surrounded by students and I'm able to kind of immerse myself in my own practice in an office, but also feel kind of like it's my own studio.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, that's come up over a couple of interviews, and I feel like that was a unique experience for me when I worked at California College of the Arts, was for the first time kind of feeling like I didn't have to keep my artist identity secret. Mm-hmm. I mean, I didn't go so far as to use my office to set up, to sort of assemble larger pieces or anything like that, although maybe I should have. But I definitely felt like it was kind of not only accepted, but like it was just sort of assumed that it was sort of like, hey, what do you do for us? And then like, what is your medium or what's your creative practice outside of this? So I feel like that is, it's nice to see that kind of as an extension of that in arts education. And then also I wonder too, if like, how are you able to tap into, like, is your work flexible at all around your creative practice? Like in the last few weeks, I can imagine as you're preparing for the show, like, do you feel like you have that flexibility or do you kind of keep things, keep the boundaries fairly firm regardless of what your creative practice looks like at the moment?
My boss the last couple of weeks has been phenomenal, not only checking in to make sure I was prepared for my show, I felt comfortable with it. We're in our busiest time, which is recruitment season. But she's also said, Lennon, I know you're going to do your work. If you need to be doing certain things during, an hour during the day, and as long as you're getting your work done, she's been very thoughtful about, oh yeah, take that minute, get those pieces done so you feel secure about that. And I think that I'm so lucky to have that kind of ability to use both, whether during the day or in the evening or however I needed to do it to get the work done. And this week, oh yeah, take that day off. Take that day off to get your installation done, get things processed. She's checking in to make sure that went well. And I think I'm really lucky there. That's one of the things I tell students who come in is if they come into our program, they could ask 99% of the people in the building a question about their work. And having so many artists who hold both administrative positions, studio manager positions, and faculty positions, we're all there to create a creative community and to help support people going forward in their practice. And so I think that when we have that much flexibility between staff and faculty, as you said, I think it just supports and creates a possibility for students.
Yeah, totally. And I'm skipping to the next question a little bit with this, but I'm curious if, as I kind of let you are a more recent graduate than most of the artists I talked to for season 1 of the podcast. And so I'm curious if like that, do you feel like that just kind of what they're seeing in terms of and I think this has been a reality for a while, that a lot of the people who work in art and design higher education, in arts organizations, are practicing artists themselves. But I don't feel like that's really been incorporated into like the professional practices side of art training. And so I'm wondering, is that something that you feel was kind of incorporated into your like graduate program? Did they talk? Because when I went through, and I feel like this was echoed in a lot of the interviews that I did, and it wasn't that long ago, but it was over a decade ago. It was sort of like most people are going because they want to teach. And so you need that terminal degree to teach at the college level. And then it's sort of like, here are some ways to get gallery representation. And then here are some ways to get into teaching. And nobody really talked about like, well, here's how different like day jobs look. And so I'm wondering if do you feel like that was part of your training at SMFA, or is it just sort of happening kind of organically and maybe even a little accidentally? How do you feel about that, being such a much more recent graduate of an art program?
Well, first of all, I think I'm in a different position having done the post-bac, because the post-bac is all about training. And I think that starts to cover some of the areas that perhaps the MFA is really more about pushing you toward that final destination, whereas post-bac is trying to set you up for the path ahead. And so I think I had that. I have two other thoughts on this. One being from an admission standpoint, that we're seeing younger students come to graduate schools now after, closer to having left their BFA than taking many years off and then coming doing a master's program. And I think it's about creating the community and the possibilities that you need to understand whether it's going to be working in a job or teaching. I don't see as many people coming just to teach anymore. But I think that we've opened up more professional practices classes. And I think that students have opportunities now. I know I did that helped me learn those lessons earlier on, like how to work with galleries outside of school, how to start preparing teaching philosophies. I was nominated for an ACAD teaching fellowship while I was here, and I had to learn these things. It wasn't through a class. It was through these possibilities and opportunities, and then reaching out to faculty and saying, how do I do this? I think at SMFA today, it's kind of like I was Mr. Miyagi'd a little bit, that they said, oh, here are the opportunities. Here's how you do it. Make it work. And I think that for me made me a little bit scrappier than just having a class, even though we do have a couple of those.
Yeah, totally. It's funny, the Mr. Miyagi, and I do think that like artists are just I don't think it's a bad thing that we are expected to be really scrappy and sort of figure it out. And in my time at museum school, I definitely felt like it was like this, however that expression goes, like the squeaky wheel gets the oil or whatever. Like there were so many opportunities that you could take advantage of, but you really did have to take initiative and kind of pursue them, and then figure out who you needed to tap to like get your questions answered. And but it's interesting, I'm just very fascinated by the trends in, people who apply to the MFA program in particular and what draws them. So backing up just a little bit, was teaching a motivation for you in pursuing the MFA degree?
It wasn't initially. When I came in, my mom's a teacher. I was anti. I just wanted to become a better artist and learn how to survive. But through the program, when I was TAing and I saw all these opportunities of amazing mentors, I was like, that's what I want to do. I always thought maybe when I was like a little bit older, like say 50, and I thought that as a printmaker, I'd have more to share. But I'm starting to feel that through all the research I'm doing, the work I'm doing, I'm starting to have something to say I'd like to share. And I think that came in my doing the program, whereas not beforehand.
Right. And probably I would imagine you're in your, professional position, like to see it from an admissions perspective, has that contributed to your desire to maybe pursue teaching in the future?
Oh, definitely. I kind of feel like I'm already starting to talk about what we do in art and why we do this and help students through that path. And I think that there are so many things as artists that are teachable moments, and I'm already starting to do those in admissions. And I'd love to keep pushing that and keep working about diverse moments and how we create these moments for the kind of rival challenging spots in art education.
So let's talk then a little bit more about your current day job. Talk a little bit more about what you do. What is a typical workday like for you? And we've already talked about kind of how you negotiate the space, but how do you fit in studio time?
So my job consists of giving prospective graduate students tours of both the main SMFA campus as well as our graduate studio building. I do portfolio reviews. I attend graduate recruitment events. I create content about our current grad students for hosting on different platforms, as well as working with current students to find out more about their work and share that for the program. Currently, I find it whenever I have a minute to do the work. During recruitment season, we're oftentimes working more hours than the traditional 8 hours a day. So it's just kind of on the weekends and after or wherever I can find the spot. But that's one thing about having my office as a workspace is I could work till 4:30 when my job ends and then just start working here, whatever kind of project that is, and giving myself that time.
Yeah. Are you able to flex your time at all? Like with, it sounds like maybe some weeks you have sort of a more traditional work week or work day, but then some weeks you're doing events in the evenings and on the weekends. Are you able to flex your time when things are maybe a little bit slower and carve out a little more studio time?
I attempt not to unless I really have to, but I think that one thing I am doing during the day, which is kind of a unique situation, is in creating all this content and having these discussions with current students and faculty and all these practicing artists who come to visit, is that I am working on my research. So maybe I'm waiting for production mode till the weekends or after the work hours, but I'm constantly taking notes on what's shaping, what's evolving, and seeing these shows and going to these talks, which becomes part of work, then helps me to structure, the work when I go to make it. And so I think that's kind of interesting to have that as part of the day.
So you remained in the Boston area since finishing your MFA degree in 2017. And, I don't know how many of the interviews you've been able to listen to, but it's a kind of split. Like most of the people that I went to school with at museum school have somewhat dispersed. And then I interviewed a few people locally who went to and work at CCA and they've stayed. And so it's really, it's interesting to me, especially looking back, like, had I stayed in Boston or had I gone to grad school here? So I'm wondering, how do you think that choice, and whether it's by design or whether you just kind of have stayed around, how do you think that has shaped your creative practice and community?
Well, I'm not from the Boston area, so I definitely, upon graduating, made the choice to stay. And I think that was all about the community that I was already forming. And true enough, in my year as well, I think about half the people stayed and half left. And now, about 3 years out, I think we're down to probably a quarter or still around, and the rest have moved on. But I was still finding the extended SMFA community to be a resource, and I was still finding work that could be done here. And I figured I had that time to make that work and those connections, and that I should utilize those as long as they were available. One of the things I was able to do now a couple summers ago was I worked with quite a few SMFA alum from various years, including like 14, 17, 18, 16, on this project called the Webster Court Project, which was in Newton, and it was founded in part by Mark Cooper, who's one of the faculty at SMFA. And so it was a house where we essentially just took it over, and each room was converted into an artist project by a different artist. And that was just phenomenal to have this chance to work with these different generations of SMFA artists. And I think that I'm still finding opportunities to kind of work with them and find these moments of mentorship. And so I think having both the student connections as well as the faculty connections, having my former advisor still send me like, oh, Lennon, I saw this show in the area. I think this is great for you. I'm still kind of utilizing those moments as I am I would say a new artist out of grad school, still a couple of years. I know I'm a little bit younger there. And I think that staying in the shadow of this for a while is pretty helpful.
Yeah, totally. And on the flip side, because I definitely think there's, a lot of benefit to staying in the area where you do your program for all the reasons you just outlined. But then obviously with social media and technology, we can connect, beyond. I don't think there's I still think it's really beneficial to either kind of stay in that community for a while or move to kind of an art center. But I don't think the pressure is quite as intense as it maybe used to be. Right. Yeah. So can you talk a little bit more about that? Because you mentioned something in the survey response about how you, even some of your, fellow, like your friends, your fellow artists from your community who are in the same area, you are still relying on social media or like these group chats to kind of maintain those connections and maybe develop some new connections. So I'm curious if you can talk a little bit more about that, specifically in terms of how you talk about your work with each other and kind of push that forward, almost because it sounded to me almost like a mini virtual group crit,
It really is. I have one friend who she just started working at SMFA as well. These are both people who had done the undergrad program. We met through different job mediums while we were here. And then another who's in Massachusetts, and she was working at SMFA. And we started this group chat where we all had very different practices. But we would come together to go to each other's shows, to talk about work we were working on. And maybe I was stuck on a research point. In fact, when I was starting the show that I have out now, I wasn't sure if this was the direction I was interested in pushing. And through these conversations, maybe I'll just send them a picture and say a couple of words of, here's the point I'm trying to make. And then I'll get a solid read with some information, or sometimes they'll give me a cold read. But these are definitely people that if we're having problems with each other's shows or questions about maybe, am I going in the right way, or do I need to take this to a different medium? These are questions we work together on. And I think that what's really interesting is one of my friends is a book artist. She went to North Bennett Street School after she finished at SMFA. And then another works in photography and in metalwork, and in a little couple of other areas. And I'm more craft and sculpture and printmaking. And so we all encompass different areas that we have our own small bit of knowledge about. And we kind of share these different perspectives with each other, which is really important to our practice. And I think that it's keeping us making. I think we all have this need as friends and as strong women to kind of support each other and be there. And so these are the women I call in to go to First Fridays, or I talk about when I'm putting a proposal forward, and they check and say, well, this works or this doesn't. And we do that for each other, which is just phenomenal.
Yeah, that's great. I mean, it sounds like it's supportive, but also kind of keeps you accountable in a way. Like,
yes,
you kind of push each other. And you touched on this really briefly in terms of like going to First Friday together. So I'm curious if you do kind of bring that, the connection that's kind of made more possible through technology, if you do kind of bring that into like the old school studio visit with that group or with other people, like how do studio visits or other, like going to First Friday together, how does that kind of work alongside like the group chats, for example?
A great example is one of the women in the group chat, Christina McComb. She has a piece that she's worked on with the Boston Athenaeum, and she's putting an artist book together with photos of their work. And so she and Sephora, who's the other young woman on this chat, they've been working on the project together. I came to their show. We talked about some of the points that worked on the book and what might be more useful. She showed me some of the points where she's having trouble, and we kind of talked about some of the pieces that might make it easier. And then Christina came to my office a couple weeks before I applied to the show at Gallery 263. And she was like, here's what really works. We talked about scale versus formatting. They helped me think through, as this was my first major kind of putting my work out there since grad school, we talked about what the needs were of the space and what the needs were of what I was trying to propose as an idea. And so we oftentimes it's just whatever events we were already thinking about working with, and we go to where we need to be, where they ask us to go.
Talk a little bit more about how, maybe not talking about this show just yet, but leading up to the show since you've graduated, how and kind of how often have you been able to show your work since graduating? And related to that, does any of your income result from selling your artwork?
When I graduated, I don't know how true this is for other MFA graduates. I felt like I needed a time period to kind of check and see where I was at in terms of doing such intense research and pushing out work for 2 years, to kind of check in and see where I was in terms of my work. And so I think, especially at the beginning and throughout the last couple of years, I've been trying to see who I was in terms of branding, like reframing and thinking about the structure of my work. So I put an impetus on myself to apply or to be in at least 2 shows a year. And so I've done that a couple times a year. And then I sell at the SMFA art sale, to be honest. That's where I sell most of my work at this point. But the other thing I do, which is really not about the art I'm making, but my practice, is I've done workshops, whether that be with the Michigan Indiana Educational Council, doing paper making workshops, or I just did a presentation at the Wing in Boston on how to do papel picados. So it's also sharing my practice in terms of making money by doing that.
So now let's talk about your current show, which is, I'm super excited. I wish I was there to be able to see it in person. So this is at 263 Gallery in Cambridge. You know, this show explores really, very similar to kind of my interest in this podcast, how having a full-time job impacts artists' time for creativity and practice. You incorporate office supplies inspired by your day job into the materials that you're using for the work in the show. And I want to quote from the press release that Allison sent me. This dichotomy between office and artist mirrors the visual conversation of bicultural aesthetics. There is a need for artists to toe the line of formal office structure while maintaining their critical and creative thinking practices. This kind of divergent thinking is similar to those who identify with multiple cultures and strive not to lose one culture in favor of another. So I'm wondering if we could talk a little bit more about that parallel between your kind of dual identity as an artist and kind of working in a formal formal office structure, paralleled with this with your sort of multicultural identity, and how you, quote, find balance by employing all aspects of your identity.
So to start with, the work is based on being bicultural between Mexican and Native American, and a very kind of historically American English way back kind of Declaration of Independence signing roots. So kind of structurally different ideas in my history. And I think that there have been times in my own bicultural identity that I've had to toe a line of finding kinds of language that make sense, kind of like shifting the structure of how I identify myself. And how I thought that matched to an office space was that there are certain terms and ways of working and modes of working that we have to structure very different than being an artist. A strict format in terms of being in the office hours, a kind of language that, when I'm doing recruitment or when I'm doing admissions processing, terms I've never heard of, versus, you think of a medium, you think of a type of visual plane. It's a different structure in how we think. One is more format. You want to think about inquiry and structure and how you bring in numbers. Another is thinking outside the box. And I think that combining them is walking this line where you have to be creative, but not rock a boat. You want to keep things going because there's so many other people, whereas an artist for me is more independent. And I think that I do the same thing culturally, having to kind of understand and code switch a little bit for what I understand from one family to the other side of the family.
Yeah, totally. And really, it seems like you're touching on this idea of really employing all aspects of your identity.
Yeah, it's trying to keep it without losing another part of oneself. It's that one part of your life isn't more important than the other, and to make sure that both are being represented equally, utilizing the artistic voice while keeping connection in the office and through culture. I do the same. I think I try and do the same thing.
Can you talk a little bit more about maybe a couple of specific pieces that are in the show?
Well, so each piece had the requirement of including at least one quote unquote office element, whether it be push pins or Post-it notes or coffee filters. And then they had one element of an art. So say like Strathmore paper or even like glue or something simple that was also kind of art office adjacent. One of the pieces is a giant flower mural. So it's about 66 inches by 120 inches. And it's comprised all of coffee filter flowers. So I've also added another element of also using traditional craft skills, especially those related to the quote unquote Mexican style, which is an incorrect interpretation. So things like piñatas and paper flowers and papel picados, which are attributed to Mexican culture, but really come from other cultures. So paper flowers are something we consider very Mexican, but are also actually Chinese and used in other cultures, including India. But these paper flowers that are in this piece, they are all hand dyed with food coloring and writ dye, and then they're composed into patterns on the wall that kind of mimic global patterns. The intent of this piece is also to kind of serve as a shrine. So you walk up to it and it will be surrounded by live flowers. So you get the smell of flowers. And then you are also reminded of a shrine, which something maybe you'd see on the side of the road or you'd see in an area of worship.
So did the kind of like, I guess, the way that you're executing the work and kind of incorporating these office elements, did that come from kind of being in your day job for a certain amount of time? Like how did you kind of come across this or how did you sort of like decide to kind of make that parallel?
Well, when you asked if I changed and did some of my work during the day and how I used that time, I started noticing that there were things like Post-it notes that had a similar feel. And so I started looking, I use this pin. This pin reminds me of beadwork. I started thinking of native beadwork and all the beads and all these little pieces. And when I looked at pins, they had the similar use. So I would be at work and thinking, this reminds me of something I would use in crafthood. And so I started thinking what other elements of craft overlap with those of the office. And so I started looking for things that had purpose, that looked like it had a duality that was similar to those of that I use in my art.
So you write in the podcast survey, and we kind of have talked about this, I think, a little bit already, but that, and I'm quoting you, accessibility to an art school and arts community, being close to art and talking about your own artistic practice is beneficial in the work you do during the day. Can you elaborate on a little bit more if you want to say anything more about this kind of choice? Because I think you use the words by design to sort of integrate, your paid work and your creative work, at least in terms of the kind of synergy between the two, perhaps a bit more than someone who, has a day job completely unrelated to their creative practice.
When I was in the grad program, I went to a symposium at Northeastern, and they were talking about a show at the ICA, which was on Black Mountain College. And then they started talking about the idea of art school and Black Mountain College and the idea of failure. And they brought up the statistic that for those who graduate from an art school, there's a percentage of about 25% that don't continue to make art after they leave, which totally, it kind of changed my vision of, well, why do we do these things if this will not be our path afterwards? And so when I said by design, my goal was, how can I make this as advantageous as possible going forward, that I know I will always have two jobs, one being art, one being something that probably will pay the bills more likely, but how do I make them so that they work together and they support my artistic practice? And I think that for me, that was coming to a place that I already felt was in support of artists itself. So that's for me being the university and the SMFA, where I can talk with students, and I talk with prospective students who art is their passion and they're looking to push that forward. And it kind of helped me reinvent the way I think about my own work, and I talk about work, that I share that vision, and that I'm also holding myself accountable every day. When I tell a prospective student that I am an artist and I'm working, and they want to talk about what we're working on or what we're learning from this institution, I want to be as honest as possible. And I think that for me, being able to have people around who are so passionate about what they're doing helps me kind of keep accountable for that. And I'll also say, when students are working on things like review boards and they're kind of running around the studios, there's an electric current that you can feel in the air. And I think that it helps me want to make myself. I see their passion, I see their work, and I say, God, I have to get on that too.
Yeah,
so I
totally.
think I think that was so important.
So looking ahead, you did mention in the survey response the high cost of living in Boston, and we've touched on in this interview as well your interest in maybe pursuing teaching in the future. And so I'm wondering if you can elaborate at all on your longer term goals now that you're going into your third year out of grad school. Where do you see this balance between your paid work and your creative work in 3 to 5 years?
That's a great question. I think it changes a little bit every day. At this point, I see all these opportunities ahead, but really what it comes down to is what will be able to give me the most structure and security to continue to make. And that's why I brought up Boston being so expensive. at this point, there are so many institutions being shut down that support artists in their studio practice or spaces that traditionally support artists and those spaces that they need to work. And I find more and more people really working in their home or their apartment. And so I'm looking for a space where I can take a practice, and whether that be staying in admissions for a couple of years more until I can transfer to another institution that perhaps could be a little bit more cost effective, or that will help support a family. And then I think the greater plan will be grad school eventually, somewhere where I can kind of dive into the topics and research, including the combination of art and craft that will help me kind of have a little bit more ammunition to pull from my bag when I play with the topics I'm interested in, especially including culture and relationships. So I think first off, finding a space, second off would be grad school to help me, or another grad school, PhD, to help me kind of push those boundaries in my art practice.
Yeah. I think you're the first person I've talked to who has an MFA who wants to go back to school.
It's not an easy choice. Trust me, I'm not quite ready there, but I think I see that on the horizon and maybe like a 5-7 year plan.
Yeah, it's interesting because you talked about how the MFA program kind of gave you that like more theoretical kind of backbone to the work you're doing. So I could see that being kind of a natural evolution of where you are now eventually. And it's interesting too, because I feel like a very similar thing is happening in the Bay Area where, it's not New York, but it's definitely obviously like a cultural center. But unfortunately, a lot of artists are being moved out because of the high cost of living. And then like you mentioned, I mean, a lot of institutions that run the gamut of size, but that have been really, really important to the art scene here are moving out. So it strikes me as, if you aren't like really rooted into a place of like really negotiating like that, like in your example, like staying in Boston, staying tapped into that creative community. But as more people disperse and as those institutions leave, then I could imagine it might make more sense to, okay, where else do I want to be? Or can I go somewhere where maybe there aren't as many sort of traditional kind of art supporting institutions, but the cost of living is so low that I can really carve out more time for my practice or have a bigger space or take some time to go back to school. And I think that that's happening just all over the country right now in cities.
I've heard stories all over the place. So it's just, we see what we can do. And I think that going back to your question before, that's one of the beautiful things about having these technological practices is that I feel like I can still be in contact with people for critiques and for conversations. And I'm hoping that going forward, that's how we'll sustain, is being able to connect, see each other on these global platforms.
So I do have a final question that I did not include in the typed out questions for you, but I have to ask it at the end of every interview. Would you quit your day job if you could?
No. I really like this job. I was surprised. It's not something I'd ever thought to do. Maybe I would, if I could, I'd only come in 2 days a week and have more days in the studio. But I think that speaking with students, and it keeps me in terms of what are the conversations that are relevant? What is going on in contemporary art? What's going on in higher education and art? And I like being at the center of playing with those lines. And I think it's useful to my artist practice.
More information about Lennon can be found at artisanoffices.com. Stay tuned for more details about Season 2. Artisan Offices is produced and edited by me, Rebecca Bird Grigsby. Intro music is provided by Mr. Neat Beats. Show notes and additional episodes can be found at artisanoffices.com. If you enjoyed this episode, please consider subscribing to the podcast wherever you listen and leave the show a rating or review. This will help the podcast connect with even more artisan offices. Thank you so much for listening.